Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am truly very pleased to welcome everyone to the International Graduate Studies Seminar, proudly organized by the College of Education, United Arab Emirates University, the University of the Future, along with the Education University of Hong Kong and the University of Helsinki in Finland. I am Myra Garces Baksal, the Assistant Dean for Research and Graduate Studies for the College of Education, UAE University. I will be serving as the moderator for today's keynote address. To begin our day, it is my absolute honor and privilege to introduce the Dean of the College of Graduate Studies at the United Arab Emirates University, Dr. Ali Al-Marzouki. Dr. Ali?
Thank you, Dr. Myra. Welcome all. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this International Graduate Studies Seminar 2020. I'm very grateful to the organizing committee of the seminar from the three universities, the College of Graduates, College of Education at UAE University, the Education University of Hong Kong, and University of Helsinki, for putting together an engaging program. As you all know, the pandemic has really affected all and every one of us in one way or another. And to name a few, the welfare and mental health of all of us, whether directly or indirectly through family members, all of us have been affected. The next is digitalization. As you all know, we had to move very quickly in early 2020 to online teaching and learning. And of course, it was very challenging for our faculty members as well as our students. And many of us have children at schools, including our graduate students who have children at schools. They had to spend time with them. They had to provide them with the tools, iPads, laptops, mobiles, internet connections, all these challenges. And still, we have those challenges going on, and we have to spend time with our children. We have also research labs that were really affected. We had to close some of the labs or at least have limited access. Funding has been affected. Universities all around the world have been affected due to reduction in the student intake. Family incomes have been affected. Even our graduate students who had part-time jobs at universities were affected. And of course, internationalization has greatly been reduced. Our students used to travel to partner institutions, spend time in research labs at partner institutions. They used to attend conferences. Of course, this has been affected. Travel restrictions, visa limitations, all these have added to this, these effects. But I'm very happy that this seminar brings us all together, and it provides an excellent opportunity for our graduate students to share their scholarly work with others, and of course, to learn from each other. With that, I sincerely hope that you enjoy today and the next 2 days of discussion and networking, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali, for your very inspiring remarks. Next on our agenda, it gives me so much pleasure to introduce our visionary Dean of the College of Education, the indefatigable Dr. Najwa Al-Husani.
Thank you, Dr. Amira. Thank you very much, Professor Ali. Dear respectful colleagues, staff, friends from UAE, Hong Kong, Finland, and all over the world. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning and good afternoon to you all. It is my great honor and a pleasure today to open our International Graduate Studies Seminar. As you all know, as a result of COVID-19, graduate students and junior researchers around the world have observed a dramatic reduction in opportunities to share and present their scholarly work, give and receive feedback, and learn from one another. United Arab Emirates University, Education University of Hong Kong, and University of Helsinki have joined efforts to organize this international graduate studies seminar to address this issue, with the theme Innovative Approaches in Teaching, Learning, and Research. IGSS 2021 will provide an online platform for graduate students and junior researchers from the 3 universities to continue to develop themselves and grow as scholars, specifically in the field of education. Plenary talks, including a Meet the Editors session and faculty workshops on a variety of topics will be offered. There will be also small group students-led conversations and thematic presentations and discussions. Let me take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to all faculty from the 3 universities who participated in this seminar. And let me also thank our friends from Hong Kong and Finland for their highly professional coordination and facilitation. Professor Kerry Lee, Head of Department of Early Childhood Education and Director of the Center for Educational and Developmental Sciences, Education University of Hong Kong. Professor Birjo Onio, Professor of Special Needs Education, Faculty of Educational Sciences, University of Helsinki. And last but not least, special thanks go to the hardworking and distinguished organizing committee members, Dr. Rhoda Mayra, Professor Alfredo Bautista, Dr. Jane Sun, and Professor Birjo Onio. And I cannot end my speech without thanking the great team behind this event who spared no time and effort to make it happen. From UAE University, Aisha Naimi, Najla Al-Awais, Sana Al-Maktoum, Basma Abdallah, Ijan Shomotova. From the Education University of Hong Kong, Andy Lu, Mia Hoyi, from University of Helsinki, Theo Mbe. We are looking forward to have more collaboration and joint academic events with your esteemed universities that will contribute to the development of the academic abilities of our graduate students. Thank you all for attending and wish you a pleasant and a productive time. Shukran jazeelan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Najwa. So let me just share my screen. Okay. All right. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Najwa, for your welcome remarks. I would just like to say a few words as the representative of the Interinstitutional Organizing Committee for the International Graduate Studies Seminar 2021. Planning a huge online event such as this one took months of preparation. So rather than just focus on the challenges brought about by the pandemic, we all focused on the opportunities that could be had for the taking if we reach out to like-minded international networks and colleagues who are also willing to put in the time, the effort, the resources to make it happen. Hence, the theme, Innovative Approaches in Teaching, Learning, and Research, had to do with that idea, since we're all expected to innovate given the current reality that we are in. That being said, I also want to acknowledge the fact that the pandemic is not some abstract hurdle that we need to overcome. It is the story we are living in at the moment. This is our current narrative. And while our institutions may require us to set for ourselves institutional targets and goals, that is to be expected, we also need to be mindful of the fact that we are not just academics, we are human beings first and foremost who are concerned about our families and colleagues' safety, health, and well-being. So we do need to breathe and recalibrate every now and again and remind ourselves why we do what we do. And I implore everyone to be kinder to themselves and to be kinder to each other. Mounting an online event such as this one with nearly 400 registrants from all over the world across 3 different institutions. It is inevitable that there will be technical glitches, there will be hiccups, a few things that may not work out the way we had originally planned. So again, please be more patient and be mindful that we are all working under extraordinary conditions and circumstances, and to just stay calm, get in touch with your inner Zen, and take deep breaths. This online seminar will also not be possible without the unwavering and total support from our leadership team. And I would like to begin with a brief acknowledgement of everyone who has shown such amazing support from our team here in the UAE University. First, to our visionary dean, Dr. Najwa, who issued a dean's decree on the formation of a college committee dedicated to actualizing the vision of the International Graduate Studies Seminar. And our Dean for the College of Graduate Studies, Dr. Ali Al-Marzouki, who has always been our greatest champion and provided us with endless support, infinite patience, and just quiet encouragement. I am especially indebted to colleagues who are part of the college committee and provided help in reviewing the many student abstracts that we received for the event, namely Dr. Hassan Tayrab, Dr. Ali Shahade, Dr. Ali Ibrahim, Dr. Maria F. Stratopoulos, and Dr. Mona Al-Janahi. So there was indeed total support from the College of Education for this event. Throughout the planning of the seminar, I had the absolutely amazing Miss Aisha Al-Naiwi from the Dean's Office. Aisha has been absolutely wonderful. And our PhD student, Najla Sultan Alawais from the College of Education team, taking very strong leadership for the PhD core group, already mentioned by our Dean, consisting of Sheikh Hassana Al-Maktoum, Basma, Abdullah Abri, Aisha Shamutova. There were also many IT people who helped develop our website, created our video, helped us in the registration and the creation of the Zoom links. Thank you for being patient with our continual request for changes. You are the heroes behind the scenes indeed. And now on to our International Organizing Committee. Our first meeting with Dr. Alfredo Bautista and Dr. Sun Jin to discuss the possibilities of an online seminar for graduate students and junior researchers started on the 14th of September, if my calendar is accurate. It was really just the seed of an idea then. Dr. Pirjo Aunio from the University of Helsinki started joining us on the 28th of September, and her research assistant, Theo Umbe, joined our virtual meeting sometime in November of last year. So we have been meeting regularly on a weekly basis ever since the second week of September to brainstorm, exchange ideas, and eventually shape these thoughts into something coherent. And it has just grown and grown, our meetings becoming bigger as we bring in more people to help us realize our vision, as you can see in the photos here. Many thanks to Andy Lau and Miao Ho Yi from the Education University of Hong Kong for being such a fantastic support team, and Theo Umbe from the University of Helsinki, who still attended our meeting even when he got sick towards the end of last year. So you see our evolution and transformation, which is really quite tough to carry out, seeing that we are all coming from 3 different time zones and we all have such busy and hectic schedules. But we do find the time to meet regularly because this is important to us. Our graduate students are important to us, and we are deeply committed to conceptualizing a 3-day program that will be meaningful to everyone who took time out from their own frenzied online schedules to attend. And we sincerely enjoy just coming together, catching up on each other's work as we plan this event that has taken on a life of its own. So let me just do a quick run through of what you need to expect for today's event, which is hosted this morning by the UAE University. In a few minutes, I will be introducing our invited keynote speaker, Dr. Mark Belden, with peer commentaries from our PhD coordinator, Dr. Hassan Tayrab, and our Master of Education coordinator, Dr. Ali Shahade. Please write down your questions in the chat box. I will collate them, and if we still have time, then I will share them with the panelists. We have 4 highly interesting parallel faculty workshops running in simultaneous Zoom webinar links from 11:45 a.m. UAE time, 3:45 p.m. in Hong Kong, 9:45 a.m. in Finland. This will be followed by an informal networking session with postgraduate students and junior researchers at 1 p.m. UAE time, 5 p.m. in Hong Kong, and 11 a.m. in Finland. I would like to strongly encourage everyone to please join the informal networking sessions, as our graduate students have something very exciting planned out for different special interest groups and mixed interest groups. Tomorrow's event will be hosted by our colleagues from the Education University of Hong Kong. A lot of amazing, not to be missed faculty workshops, while day 3 will be hosted by the University of Helsinki in Finland. And now it gives me such great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Mark Belden, who is currently serving as the Associate Dean for Partnerships and Analytics at the Office of Education Research at the NIE in Singapore. He is also serving as an associate professor and was the former chair of Department for the Humanities and Social Studies Education at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Mark also happens to be a fellow book club member of mine, and we worked together at the NIE for many years before I moved here to the UAE. I have always said that as an academic, I aspired to be like Mark when I grew up. And for those of you who know me and my physical stature, perhaps it's going to happen in another lifetime. But truth be told, I have always admired Mark's sense of leadership, his inclusive approach to teaching, his non-traditional, meaning-driven, not metrics-driven approach to scholarly activity. If he eventually decides to lead an international socio-political movement or a scholastic cult, please count me in as a loyal member. I am proud to not just call him a colleague, but also a very dear friend. He has a new book that just came out this year with Dr. Tracy Alviar Martin entitled Research on Global Citizenship Education in Asia, Conceptions, Perceptions, and Practice. Join me all in welcoming Dr. Mark Belden.
Thank you very much, Myra, for that wonderful introduction. Let me share my screen and make sure it's, can everybody see that? Are you able to see the screen? Okay.
Yes, yes.
All right, good, good. So yeah, thank you very much, Myra, for the introduction. I'm not planning to start an educational cult anytime soon, but it's an interesting idea. And thank you to everybody, really. I'm truly grateful for all of the work that went into this International Graduate Studies seminar and all the people that Myra thanked. Really want to thank the visionary deans at UAE University and UAE University College of Education. And I'd especially like to thank the IGSS organizing committee. I think this is truly a visionary and innovative kind of cross-cultural event that I think is really pointing to something that I think more universities need to aspire to, and it's a much more inclusive notion of you know, how we might come together during this particular time in our history. I'd like to give you a quick overview of the presentation. And so really the purpose of the presentation is to really, as I mentioned in the abstract, to go beyond the usual technocratic solutions to improving postgraduate education, to really thinking about what it might mean to re-envision postgraduate education. And so I'm really hoping that you'll join me in re-envisioning the purposes and practices of postgraduate education to build more inclusive institutional cultures, to support different forms of scholarly work that can make different kinds of impacts, and to really be more responsive to our communities, our local communities, as well as the grand challenges of our times. And so I'll share a little bit of my thinking around that. But I think that this kind of event is really important because we need to collectively imagine, create, and enact new academic cultures among faculty and students. And so let me just get, for some reason I lost my view of where I'm at. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this question of, are we really aiming for innovation, educational innovation, or more along the lines of educational transformation? And so I'll talk a little bit about what I see as the differences between the two. And then really two big ideas around reimagining education in terms of repurposing education, and then new stories to live by, which I'll explain as I go through the talk. Spend some time on what the implications are for postgraduate education. And then we'll have some Q&A with Dr. Ali and Dr. Hassan at the end. So I'll try to leave plenty of time for them to provide some commentary, as well as for people in the audience to ask some questions and for it to be more of an exchange. So when we talk about innovation or transformation, let's make sure we're clear on terms. Educational innovation is when there's something new or different is introduced for improvement. And this can be new theories, new pedagogies, new methods, different kinds of technology tools and processes. And a lot of times we think about educational innovation in terms of technology tools. These might be platforms, different kinds of apps, but it can also be new theories. I think one of the theories that I've been drawing on recently is a theory of intersectionality. This is a theory that came from a law professor at UCLA that really looks how different systems of domination and injustice are really interconnected, so that when we think about issues of racism or sexism or about social class, we need to see these as much more interconnected and interlinked than maybe we have in the past in terms of some of the work that we've done in our research. Same thing with methods. I think there's some exciting new methods that have come about through neuroscience, for example, that are helping us better understand how learners learn, how the brain and how the mind functions. I recently did a workshop before COVID at University of Wisconsin on ethnographic, quantitative ethnography. So using a quantitative approach, kind of combining quantitative approaches and methods with ethnographic participatory methods in classrooms. In the book that Myra mentioned, I use a method called Asia as method, which is kind of like this conference. It's more about interreferencing. It's about looking across different Asian cultures to see what might be borrowed instead of from the West, instead of from Western theories of education and practices, what might be borrowed, in terms of looking at our own Asian values and practices in different Asian contexts. And so when we talk about innovation, it's not just necessarily technology, but we tend to focus quite a bit on some of the technology platforms and tools. We can assess innovation by its novelty and effect. In other words, we want to look at what kinds of changes have been brought about. Are these meaningful changes? Has it been impactful? Has it impacted classroom practice, for example, in ways that are pretty significant? And then we usually think about scalability. Is this something that can go from one classroom to many classrooms? Can it scale up at both maybe a school level or a district level or even a system level? So we tend to assess by looking at these kinds of metrics. But we hear the call for innovation because we see work and social life changing. It's been responding to new kinds of technologies. And so, education plays an important role in terms of making sure that young people especially are able to respond in terms of changes in the workplace or changes in the economy, as well as changes in social life. And it's usually seen as something that's quite vital for economic and social progress. And a lot of times this is framed as necessary for economic growth or for competitive advantage. This author, Sergei Yukov, has written about innovation. I have references at the end that you can refer to later. So this is from Deloitte University Press, provides a framework for understanding the future of work. And so I think this is a good place to start, because when we think about postgraduate education and some of the innovation and changes that are needed at the postgraduate level, and really at all levels of schooling or of education, we see particular drivers of change. This tends to be technology, and so we're seeing more and more the use of artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence, the use of robotics. I'm in Singapore, and it's always a little bit jarring to see on our campus here, there are actual robots that are on the sidewalks that are delivering food. So they're mobile, they go down the sidewalk. If they come to a pedestrian, they stop and kind of go in a different direction. But this notion that, yeah, we're living during this period of time when we're seeing these significant changes in terms of the technologies that are available to us. Sensors and data, we're moving towards big data, where we're having to make sense of huge data sets, and especially think about what does this data tell us in terms of classroom practice or in terms of our schools and how they're managed. But there's also demographic changes, and this has to do with people living longer lives. We're also seeing especially increases in elderly populations in many societies, in most societies across the world, and also more diverse societies as well. So there are significant demographic changes that require us to rethink how we educate and live in society. And then, of course, there's global markets and the power of pull in terms of customer empowerment and the rise of global talent markets. And so, you know, this idea that global talent now is can be quite mobile, move from one place to another, especially at the university level. You know, we see scholars from different parts of the world, like Myra or like myself, working in you know, other countries. And so we're seeing work and workforces redefined. And so it's really reshaping and transforming the workforce. And so what are the implications of this, especially in terms of education? So we're seeing that there's really been a push for lifelong learning, that it's really important for people to be able to adapt and to be able to kind of shift and really develop new skills just continuously. And so it's constant learning, it's lifelong learning. It's thinking about, maybe for young people, pursuing their passions, really thinking about what matters, much more of a kind of a meaning and purpose focus, like Myra mentioned. And this also has implications for organizations like graduate schools. How do we redesign work for technology and learning? How do we integrate talent across networks within organizations and across different organizations? And of course, there's implications for public policy. So again, a lot of these are technology driven, but there's also other forces that are driving change as well. And when we talk about education, we're seeing that AI, or artificial intelligence and augmented intelligence, is being more and more implemented in education settings. I'm not sure about in your settings, but in Singapore, AI Singapore is quite a force, and there's kind of an emerging research focus looking at the role of artificial intelligence in education. So this is going to be profound, I think, in some ways towards, you know, more personalized forms of learning, intelligent tutoring, virtual classroom assistance, so more virtual environments, and also the collection of large data sets around everything from cognition to AI sentiment analysis, so analyses of feelings and so on. So at NIE, we're starting to think about how do we help teachers prepare for AI in schools and in classrooms. And so you can see a workshop that we've done. It's an example of one of many workshops where we're really thinking about AI literacy. You know, how do we help teachers think about using AI to personalize learning and to shift from more standardized or standard curriculum to a more personalized, individualized type of learning environment? How can we make sure that every learner's needs are better met based on some of the data that is being used in AI? How might we create more immersive environments? So again, this effort to really help people think about how do we better use some of these technologies in terms of supporting teaching and learning in classrooms. I think the other big innovation at NIE, at least, is the science of learning. And so we've had a learning science, a very strong learning science component as an area of research at NIE and teaching as well, that is very interdisciplinary. So it draws on psychology, linguistics, field of cognitive science, instructional design. But the science of learning is moving much more deeply into neuroscience. And so looking at how neuroscience can inform educational practice, and again, helping teachers think about what might this mean in terms of their teaching practice. And so you can see that we've had, much like this conference, we've had symposiums or symposia that really help kind of bring together researchers who are doing work in neuroscience and education to think about how neuroscience can inform educational practice. This is also, again, this idea of working with big data sets. And so data analytics and learning analytics are becoming much more important. So educational data mining and thinking about how do we present this data. So one of the things that I do in my position is we have massive amounts of data, large data sets. And so we try to present that data and what it means to policymakers as well as to our teachers. And so this idea of learning analytics at the school level even is using data to inform classroom practice. And so we're seeing really, classrooms that are much more highly technological, and we're back in school face to face, but of course with online learning during COVID, and there's just greater facility with different kinds of technological tools. These are some images of makerspace, but again, we're seeing really the impact of technology in terms of shaping educational practice at all levels. Again, innovation is really, everybody's talking about innovation. It's part of a common discourse in education. However, I think it merits a closer look. And so this is a quote from Larry Cuban, who has been fairly critical of educational technology. And so, I think these are important questions that we need to ask when we think about innovation, but also especially about educational technology, whether they're technological platforms or different kinds of apps. Is it really improving academic achievement? Has teaching and learning changed much? Has the use of devices in schools led to better jobs? And this is a few years ago, but he is a bit skeptical that it's made these kinds of profound changes that educational technology at least has promised. I think I was talking with Myra prior to this, and she mentioned that actually in her classes, she's finding that the discussions and the interactions are actually much more powerful, much more meaningful for students. And so again, I think these are some important questions to think through. What is the impact of technology in terms of the ways it's affecting teaching and learning? And there's always, I think, side effects that are important to think about. Young Zhao is a scholar who has written a lot about innovation in education. And he says that, with new innovation or with innovation or new technologies, there's always these unanticipated or unintended consequences. So sometimes there's negative effects of innovation that a lot of times we're not seeing the big picture. We might be unable to perceive or accept kind of large and distant changes. We're not quite sure what these mean, what the implications might mean for educational practice. But it's important to also think about the downside of innovation or the negative effects of new technologies. And I think some of the work that I'm doing that I'll share a bit later is that, good intentions and tech solutions, we need to question whether they're really addressing some of the societal crises that we're facing. Sandra Harding, who's a feminist scholar who works in science, she's mentioned that, technology and science has created many of the crises, the societal crises, like the climate change, and even some of the crises in terms of that we're seeing with social media and the spread of misinformation and disinformation, that some of the tech solutions and kind of these ways of thinking that we have need to be addressed as well, that there are deeper cultural patterns that continue to perpetuate some of the problems rather than address some of the problems that we're facing on the planet. So it's important to think through that a bit. And so if we then switch to this notion of transformation, I think transformation calls for something quite different. And there's a lot of work around transformative learning, and this can be both at the personal level, and it tends to be changes in perspectives. So it's transformative in terms of shifting people's thinking and their beliefs. It's really kind of a shift in consciousness and awareness, but it's also shifts in behavior that we see as well, that people start to transform the ways they behave and maybe some of the relationships that they have with other people. There's also at the societal level, transformative change in terms of changing social structures and institutions. And a lot of the work around transformation talks about it being triggered by crisis. And I was glad that both of the deans at the beginning talked about this particular crisis that we find ourselves in at this particular moment. And Paul Romer is a Stanford economist who said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And so this is really a prime opportunity to rethink, to re-envision our societies, our education systems, our own particular kinds of lifestyles and beliefs that we have. And so we need to, in some ways, perhaps take advantage of this to start to make some significant changes in the ways we go about our business, especially the business of education. And so I think in particular, my work has been focusing more around climate change, and in particular, climate change denial, at least in the United States. And maybe it's because I'm an American, but these crises seem quite acute to me at this particular moment. But all three of these, in some ways, are a bit of a denial of reality, I think, to some extent. We see a profound ecological crisis in terms of climate change. I think the pandemic has raised our awareness and exposed some of the problems that we have in societies. And then we've recently seen an attack on truth and democracy. I think especially with the spread of different kinds of social media and misinformation and really deliberate disinformation campaigns around things like the pandemic and even around climate change science. And I read in the New York Times that this is becoming, this attack on truth and democracy is really a global phenomenon, that there are groups globally that seem to be mobilizing that are racist, are kind of challenging the norms that we've had in societies, at least in liberal societies. And so this is a particularly, I think, important moment in our history. And we might look at education as in crisis as well. This is a book, again, by Young Zhao, who kind of plays on this notion of, an education crisis being a terrible thing to waste as well. That education is in crisis to some extent because we've been, doing some of the same kinds of things that seem to reproduce or perpetuate some of the problems that we're kind of coming to grips with at this particular moment. In the United States, there's been a lot of talk about how some of the people in government and in terms of corporations have all been educated in some of the finest universities in the world and in the United States. And so we're seeing that education perhaps has to play a role in this sort of transformation of societies. And so, there's this real, I think we're coming to this notion that we can't continue in the same old way, but we're not quite sure of what the alternatives are. But we recognize that there's a need to pivot. There's a need to kind of change course in particular ways. I think both as societies and as individuals, and especially in terms of education. And so what might that look like? And so what I wanted to focus on is this idea of transformative shifts in consciousness, relationships, and in institutions, and rethinking and reimagining postgraduate education, especially in terms of repurposing education. So it's much more about the vision. It's much more about the transformative vision, perhaps, that can drive education and drive the ways that we think about using different technologies, really rethinking the purposes of education. And so I'll talk about these two items, repurpose education, as well as new stories to live by. So one of the things that I'm seeing more and more of is that schools of education are organizing really their teaching and learning around grand challenges. And this is from the College of Education at Stanford University. And you'll see 9 grand challenges. And you can see they focus around transformative technologies, really thinking about how technology can really support learning across the lifespan, but better systems of education. So at the systems level, really thinking about how educational inequity might be addressed, thinking about what a worthwhile education is, rethinking kind of the purposes and the meaning of education. Science of learning is a part of that. Data is a key part. Those are some of the innovations that I just mentioned. I'm really thinking more about the relationship between research and practice, sort of research practice nexus. And I was really happy that yesterday, Nanyang Technological University that I'm a part of, that the National Institute of Education is part of, came out with 4 grand challenges yesterday that I think in a similar fashion, they're hoping will kind of drive or kind of focus both teaching and research at the university level. And the 4 grand challenges at Nanyang Technological University that were just announced yesterday are mitigating our impact on the environment, harnessing the science, art, and technology of learning, addressing technology's impact on humanity, and I would say on the planet, and responding to the needs and challenges of healthy living and aging. So really, I think this notion of, how can we focus postgraduate education in terms of the teaching and the work that we do around these grand challenges that are really confronting communities really across the planet. They may manifest themselves in different ways in different cultures or in different nations, but these are really common challenges or shared challenges that we see confronting people from all societies across the world. Another thing that I think, again, helps focus or drive teaching and learning at the university level is a vision of what it means to be future ready. And this is from NIE, and it's really focused around teaching, learning, and research for life. So I think it's an effort to move away from sort of the more instrumental focus on preparing young people for work and the world of work, to thinking more broadly about life and what an education for life might mean. And so we have lifelong, life deep, life wide, and life wise. And so really thinking about connecting learning to purpose. So in some ways similar to what Stanford University presented, really thinking about the kinds of knowledge and dispositions that are very purposeful and that will support learning over time, really about connecting with purpose and passion. Life deep is kind of that intentional experiential learning. So it's sort of deep disciplinary understanding, but it's also adaptive expertise, being able to apply that learning to new situations. Life-wide is about connecting your learning to real-world applications. So it's the transfer of learning across different contexts and different kinds of problems. It's much more multi and transdisciplinary. And then life-wise has to do with really thinking about values and empathy. And I think, you know, Myra touched the right tone where, you know, it's really thinking about meaning. It's meaning driven. It's about care. It's about compassion. It's about really, you know, more civic kinds of notions of responsibility and outreach. These are a couple of, I think, examples that are quite valuable. Some of the work that I'm doing at NIE now is really thinking more about how do we produce research and teaching that has greater social impact, that it's really not just for scholarly output, but it's about working with different stakeholders to co-produce knowledge, working in sort of diverse communities. So it's much more community-based, focused around community-based values and partnerships. So this notion of co-production, notion of partnership is really about building capacity within the university, but within communities as well. And so thinking more about what that might look like. I think there's some principles that are based on some of the things that I shared just a couple of minutes ago. I think one is that they're problem focused. So we look for shared problems, common problems. These might be classroom problems that we see teachers struggling with. They might be problems of policy that we're working with policymakers around. They might be the grand challenges that were presented, but they're very problem focused. And this is really moving towards more of an idea of public engagement and public scholarship. So it's really thinking more about social innovation, social impact, community engagement. This might mean working with arts communities, with members of civil society, with NGOs, with industry, with government around you know, different kinds of policy. So it's much more of a public form of scholarship than I think the kind of traditional academic scholarship that we have seen in universities. It's cross-disciplinary. It's much more inclusive of different communities within societies and of different kinds of knowledge. It's much more inclusive of different forms of knowledge. It's cross-cutting and integrative. Again, it's kind of more synthetic or syncretic that brings together different kinds of knowledge and works together with people that come from different forms of backgrounds. And we really, I think another principle is that it involves everyone in making decisions. So it's democratic decision making, much more democratic, grounded in local communities, much more relational and justice oriented as well. The practices that are necessary, one of the things at NIE that we're working on is research impact literacy, so that it's really helping researchers understand social impact. We're well versed in scholarly impact in terms of citations and H-index and things like that, but how do we make greater impact in terms of, you know, policy or in classroom practice or even in society? So it's a broader notion of research impact, and we're looking at both individuals developing research impact literacy as a set of skills that are necessary for researchers, and really it's about how do I broker different kinds of relationships, how do I partner with different kinds of community-based partners. But we're also looking at institutional research impact literacy. So it's opening up kind of the institution a bit more to thinking more broadly about impact, that it's not just scholarly impact in journals and presenting at conferences and things of that nature, but there's a broader range of impacts that we need to be more knowledgeable about, more aware of. It's much more ecological, it's participatory. I think engaging in practices of dialogue and deliberation and debate. Again, I come from a humanities and social studies education perspective, and so these are just core to my very being, these notions of engaging people around issues. So it's very issues driven or problems driven. It's inquiry based, but it's really about dialogue, talking with different people, raising our awareness kind of together, bringing different perspectives to the table. It's about deliberating, working together to make decisions, to make informed decisions. These are democratic, fundamentally civic democratic practices. But it's much more place-based and community-based. And so, emphasizing more community-based design research and research partnerships. And I think for schools of education or universities, it might suggest we need to move towards more of a problem-based funding model. So for example, really kind of incentivizing people to do work in whatever ways they can around some of those grand challenges or some of the fundamental problems that people are working together around. So I think as a graduate student, finding, what is my role here? What is the part that I can play around one of these grand challenges? And then thinking about how everyone is contributing to the building of knowledge related to those challenges. And so this idea of repurposing education for me is pretty key. So really seeing postgraduate education as a site for big ideas and difficult conversations, where we're asking each other, where are we going? Who's gaining, who's losing, and by which mechanisms of power? So making power much more explicit, I think, in the conversations. Is it desirable? Who gains, who loses? Is it actually desirable? So again, it's kind of thinking, if we go back to the ideas of innovation that I was sharing, certain people gain, and to tell you the truth, a lot of technology companies have been gaining tremendously by selling technology to educational institutions. But who's losing in some of these equations? Who's sort of being left out? Is that desirable? And what should be done about this? So these are some basic questions that I think are important, at least in the social sciences and in education. There's also a notion of institutional reflexivity, and really it's the capacity of an institution to really reflect in terms of their core values and practices, and really asking hard questions about ourselves as institutions in terms of maybe some of those same questions. Where are we headed? What's our purpose? What's our mission? What's driving us? And it requires, which I think is something quite challenging for institutions to do, this ability to kind of change course, to really reconsider the direction of an institution. And there's one example that I wanted to share, which is at the University of Aberdeen. And there's a University of Aberdeen manifesto that was developed by, I believe, both faculty and graduate students, which is really, I think, quite powerful and quite empowering. It's titled Reclaiming Our Universities. And they really are calling for a much more community-based, that they have obligations, there are obligations to communities, that there's a need for more of a civic orientation to kind of think about what these obligations and responsibilities are. But I would recommend taking a look at that document. I found it to be quite unique, I think, in some ways. I don't see many universities that bold, I think, but it was very much driven by faculty and students. And reclaiming is sort of reclaiming from these sort of business models of education that have been in operation for quite some time, where we see, again, they're very much driven by kind of business practices in some ways, these kinds of managerialism and some of the metrics that are being used. I wanted to turn, I'll try to wrap up here fairly soon, but I wanted to also share some of the work that I've been doing around climate change. And we've been drawing on, this is an article that we wrote, and we have a book proposal in as well. I've been working with literacy scholars around climate justice, and really using the work of a eco-linguist, Aaron Steeb, who wrote us a very nice email about this article in the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, where he said that this article was really the closest to an application of eco-linguistics that he's seen. But this idea that we live by particular kinds of stories, we have stories that we live by. And what these stories do is they kind of frame how we think about the world. They create mental models, and they're all around us. And I'll share some examples, but they're in everyday texts, and they really permeate all aspects of society. And so this notion of creating new stories to live by, that we can create more beneficial stories. And in this article, we outline indigenous narratives of place, some gender work around climate justice, and youth activism as well. And these are really stories of hope and stories of justice. They're much more justice oriented. And so some of the work that we've done is, analyzing different kinds of texts, like media texts, and analyzing these sort of stories that we live by. And we're finding destructive stories, some that are kind of ambivalent, that are sort of in the middle there when it comes to thinking about the climate or about our ecology. And we find some that are beneficial. The classic, I guess a classic example of this, and maybe you see this in your context as well, probably less so in Hong Kong since it's more urban, but this notion of SUVs kind of running roughshod over the environment as if it's a playground, and really that the world just exists to gratify human desires. So this very anthropocentric view of the environment. We see in our media, we hear it in different kinds of stories. This was one that we found quite prominent, where humans are really separate from nature. And so it's this notion of anthropocentrism, or kind of a human-centric notion, that's quite prominent, I think, in media and a lot of different texts. These are just a couple of examples. Another one that we find is destructive is this idea of consumerism as the path to happiness. And the classic example there is Bush after 9/11, President Bush in the United States after 9/11 saying, we need to get back to shopping. Don't let anything bother you, that, let's go about consuming and shopping. And so we see this in quite a few popular media texts as well, and in some of the stories that are communicated, that consumerism is the main path to happiness. But we also see, ambivalent stories, but there's some that are much more beneficial. And I think the work ahead is to locate, explore, and create more beneficial stories to live by, that kind of situate people in place, that communicate stories about relationships to the environment that are quite different, or that are stories of empowerment or maybe of social justice. And so we see a lot of, environmental movement action, I think, that's quite hopeful, quite beneficial. The image in the lower right-hand corner is from Singapore. And so young people in Singapore also, working as activists around climate change. I think some of these notions are quite powerful. Before we went on, we were talking about Amanda Gorman, who gave the inaugural, read her inaugural poem at the inauguration of President Joseph Biden. And again, it's very hopeful. I mean, to see a young person, writing in that way and speaking in that way, and talking about the future in a very empowering way. These are the kinds of stories that, I think are important. So this notion of creating new stories to live by, I think aligns with what I mentioned earlier about recognizing a broader range of knowledge and impacts and contribution in inclusive communities based on relationship and trust. Stories of contribution. Michael Sandel, the political philosopher at Harvard, has a new book out where he talks about contributive justice, this idea of, that everybody can contribute, that everybody has a role to play, that it's really kind of a notion of social responsibility and community, that people can contribute in their own particular ways to the improvement of social problems and well-being in society. And it's, I think, helpful to think about research and teaching as telling stories. I used to use a planning tool that was really designing lesson plans as stories. This works well. I'm not sure how it might work in other subjects, but it works really well in the humanities and in social studies education in particular. But research also tells stories, and some of which are more or less insightful and useful in helping us understand and navigate the world. And Cleo Cherry-Holmes was a professor of mine at Michigan State University, and he talked about how stories do a lot of things. That research, these research accounts allow researchers to connect to historical developments or highlight political agendas, point to political structures. And these stories are open to different interpretations. But thinking about your own particular research as a story, what kind of story might it tell? What's the nature of that story? And so to move into thinking about the implications for postgraduate education, it's really about creating more time and space to talk about some of these larger questions. It's really about cultivating cross-disciplinary expertise, or T-shaped people that have kind of are able to work across different disciplines, either through their collaborations with others or maybe in terms of their own expertise. Howard Gardner has written about this as the sort of the synthesizing mind. People that have kind of a searchlight intelligence are able to kind of make connections between different types of knowledge or different work. I think these kinds of skills to kind of see things more holistically, in a more synthetic way, to see how things kind of fit together is very important. Public scholarship for social impact. And then I think during COVID, especially, what's happened to universities, it's I think becoming more and more difficult to get positions in universities and positions in academia. So there's a need to really recalibrate postgraduate education to think about a broader range of career interests and opportunities, different kinds of interests that students might have. In my own work, it's continually keeping this foregrounded. How might we create more just and sustainable futures? And apologies for the plug there of my recent book with Tracy, but this is, I think, the kind of the driving question as we look across different Asian contexts around global citizenship education. How are teachers and students teaching and learning in ways that might create or promote more just and sustainable futures? This is something that was written in another article where Roberto de Rook and I were thinking about, instead of just self-interest and certainty, students might be asking questions about who they want to be, more about the consequences of their decisions and the types of jobs they might take on, what kinds of social relationships they might desire or want, and really think about who or what is harmed in terms of the type of world they're building. So it's thinking more about those kinds of questions in terms of thinking about, again, along these lines of the stories we live by. Are they more destructive in particular ways, or are they more beneficial? Are they contributing to something larger in terms of maybe social justice or in terms of social well-being? So I guess in terms of, coming to a close, I think as graduate students, postgraduate students, it might be important to ask what kinds of new or more satisfying stories you might create and enact. It's really around the kinds of questions you ask, the kinds of consequences for the work that you do, the types of social relationships you want to create within educational institutions, but also outside, I think, in terms of being able to partner with different groups, different communities, different kinds of knowledge. And the fundamental question is, what type of world will you build through the kinds of topics that you investigate? So in conclusion, I think some of the transformative shifts that I'm suggesting is that when we think about postgraduate education and universities in general, it's not either or, it's kind of both and. I recognize that we're not going to completely give up high status knowledge because that's kind of the bread and butter of universities, sort of knowledge that's highly abstract and generalized and theoretical. But it's really moving towards more respect for diverse knowledges and knowledge communities. These might be intergenerational, which I guess another word for that would be tradition, based on traditional values. It could be more indigenous. These forms of knowledge are, I think, becoming more vital as we think about our ecological crisis. So it's much more ecological. It's about seeing things in relationship. It's much more systems based. Another shift, I think, is moving away from just pure scholarly impact to really thinking more about the commitments we have to local communities, the communities around us, around universities. And it's really focused around partnering for social impact and social innovation. It's also moving from this sort of narrow disciplinary expertise and operating in silos, which are usually along disciplinary boundaries, to much more of a notion of transdisciplinary expertise and thinking about what does it mean to create knowledge with diverse others. So again, that sort of T-shaped person, someone that can work across different kinds of domains and across different sorts of communities. Moving from narrow metrics like citation counts and H-index to really a broader range of impact measures in terms of knowledge mobilization. How are we mobilizing knowledge so that other communities benefit from that knowledge? How do we make our research knowledge much more accessible and useful for different stakeholders, different communities? How do we make sure that knowledge is actually making an impact in terms of some of the implementation? And then moving from narrow academic specialization and training at the postgraduate level to really thinking about broader career development, that a lot of the jobs that perhaps all of you will be looking at are not necessarily going to be in academia. They're not going to be professorial jobs. The professoriate generally has taken quite a hit during this crisis. I think as one of the deans mentioned, there's been challenges in terms of funding and things have been quite disruptive. And so really thinking about, are there other sectors of society, whether it's in civil society, who can use these skills, research skills, educational skills that are developed in graduate school? It could be working in different types of communities, working together with people in different ways. And so I will end there so that we have some time for the commentary as well as Q&A. And there's also some references there. I'll be glad to share the slides. But thank you very much. And again, thank you to everybody that organized this, that was involved in giving me this opportunity to share. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark. Really a lot of thoughtful questions, very thought-provoking insights that you shared with us. It is my pleasure to welcome now Dr. Hassan, Professor Hassan Tairab, our PhD coordinator from the College of Education, to maybe share his commentary, his insights. Dr. Hassan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Myra, for this. Let me share my screen if I have a few words to show, if I can. Okay, let me find out where's my screen. Here it is. Okay, can you see that, please?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Dr. Mark. I think Dr. Mark has presented enlightening ideas and in a very timely analysis and very convincing arguments that shape the future of how to re-envision the postgraduate education. And I think your presentation left nothing for us to comment. So, so we have to come up with something new if we can. But I think there is indeed no better time to think about re-envisioning and rethinking about postgraduate education more than at the moment, with all the problems, all the changes happening around us in terms of pandemic, in terms of technological things, in terms of political around the world. So these are all require some kind of closer look and rethinking of postgraduate education. But I see the re-envisioning should focus on the three pillars of our practice, and that is the teaching and learning and research. That is because we need to justify our involvement in learning and teaching, teaching and learning and research, so that we can have clear ideas about what we are going to do in the future. So why that? Because there are some changes for the postgraduate education around the world. And currently, Dr. Mark also mentioned something about what I mentioned, what I say as one-size-fits-all approach and its impact on postgraduate education in terms of expectation, perception, and future direction. One-size-fits-all institution, like no longer the educational institution being treated as in the past. In the past, the focus of education institution about training, professionalizing graduates to become teachers and become educators. But nowadays, the role have changed and we become part of wider institutions, and the measure of the success of all postgraduate education will be measured or assessed by one size, and that's equivalent to the rest of the colleges and specialization. So we need to reconsider the one size fits all. Later on, I'll speak about the metrics. Dr. Martin mentioned also as well. Also, we need to think about the new perception of a scholarship of teaching and learning in postgraduate education, whether focus on training or focus on mobilization of knowledge, as Dr. Marx mentioned. Also, there are some suggestions by Dr. Mark that there must be some kind of new approach to re-envisioning scholarship of teaching and learning within the environment of creativity and productivities that go beyond active quantification to create an advance and transform knowledge. I love the idea of the nexus, innovation, transformation, whether we should innovate or whether we should transform. And I think Mark is right to say that we should also focus more on transforming rather than just innovation. Because the innovation is good ideas, but we need to transform what we innovate in terms of ideas, concepts, and practices to something that are really useful for and has impact for the society and the community. Also, Mark suggested some kind of new approach for seeing the re-envisioning, and I see the re-envisioning require some new ideas like evidence-based curriculum and pedagogy. This is equivalent to what Dr. Mark mentioned in Singapore, the grand challenges. The grand challenges, we have them here as priorities. In our context here, we identify priorities for research, for teaching, and for preparation for the future, including education. So this is required to me some kind of evidence-based curriculum pedagogy in order to achieve what the policymaker required in the future. We also need to have some kind of evidence-based teaching and learning. This is also related to the national priorities by which we need to move from the traditional teaching and learning to a more inquiry-based, more productive skill-based that have impact on society and on individual, not only in terms of gaining degrees, but in terms of influence on the communities and influence on the societies. And hopefully these changes in the perception of research within the postgraduate education will lead us to envision new approach to the whole concept of postgraduate education. And I think in order for that to happen, we should have a clear characteristics of an institution that could engage in some kind of transformations. And I came up with some kind of some studies that classify some kind of criteria need to be there in the institution in order to be more innovative and transformative in their approach. They must have a clear, identifiable goals so that they can achieve within well thoughtful and well thought of and visible goals that they can become the focus of the transformation, of the future transformation. And also they should embrace culture, new culture, community, share goals and scholarship values, and move away from the, Mark said, the metrics of, for example, high index and publication and citation, to a more usable approach that value the scholarship and value the idea of knowledge and knowledge transformation. And they also successful institution, they should have mentoring scheme or mentoring programs that are well defined in order to help the advance the growth and the development and professional development of its member, so that they can value the knowledge and also become more transformative in their approach in the future. And also, in addition to that, we should have also some kind of criterion for individuals in order to be more transformative in their approach. They must be driven by exploration. They have the motivation to do that. They become more involved to explore through innovation and creativity and also transformation. They also should have the content knowledge. And that's actually some of the criteria is needed for the postgraduate study, whether at the PhD level or master level. They must be familiar with their own discipline. And at the moment, there are multidisciplinary approach. They need also to be more familiar with other areas that they can contribute to the professional growth and the knowledge construction. Also, the idea mentioned by Mark also is the collaboration. Also, they must be committed to collaborating with colleagues from other institutions. And I think this conference or this seminar is a demonstration of that. So individual as well as institution need to be collaborative or collaboration in their approach, so that they can share and come to consensus between them. So I see the teaching and learning should be based on evidence-based. We should move from instruction to construction. Instruction, the traditional, as I mentioned a little bit earlier about inquiry-based approach and a new transformation of teaching and learning. And I think we already embraced that in the last few years. We have witnessed some kind of changes to our practice here. So we become more constructive in our approach to teaching and learning. And also, at the moment, there are evidence-based, also cross-cutting, multi-skill curriculum and pedagogy in order to create the things mentioned by Mark in the last piece of his presentation. That, I think, is necessary in order to live by or to engineer the postgraduate education in a more prolific and more impacting ways. We also need to change also research practices. Evidence-based community practices, this is what is also mentioned by Mark in the last piece of his presentation. We should move away from the narrow metric approach to a more impacting community involvement-based approach, so that we can share knowledge, construct knowledge, co-construct knowledge. And of course, we should have a transformative agenda that leads all the whole process. And then we need to celebrate and share our characterized values that emerge from the whole practice of research or teaching and learning or scholarship in general. And I think this last piece of my presentation is about changes. These are really demonstrating what we are engaged at the moment in terms of thinking about transforming knowledge to something new. The world was, as we have created, it's a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our own thinking. Albert Einstein. This, I think, is a very relevant quote to mention at this context here. And also, any change, even a change to the better, is always accompanied by drawbacks and discomfort. And that's why people resist change and sometimes stick to the traditions of teaching and learning. And the last one is the world hates change, yet it's the only thing that has brought us to this progress is ourselves. So I think we need to conceptualize this kind of changes and transformation within the new context, within the new concept, so that we move forward and we have some kind of new approach to postgraduate education. One thing about that, at the moment we are introducing some kind of changes to our own PhD program. Hopefully we take off maybe in the very near future. We try to transform the traditional research dissertation to something else, like transcript dissertation. And that's still a seed idea, but hopefully it will take shape in the future, in the very near future. And I think that's my own observation about Mark's presentation. Again, thank him very much for that. And I think he has made some kind of impact on my own thinking about how to transform and to innovate. Thank you very much. I hope I'll stick to my own time, no more than that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hassan. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our Master of Education Coordinator, Professor Ali Shahade.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Mayra, thank you, Dr. Hassan, and thank you, Dr. Mark, for the presentation, for the revolutionary presentation. And I mean it, revolutionary presentation. When I look at your transformative shifts, they are really revolutionary. And what I see from your presentation is three things which you are trying to repurpose and question: the use of technology in education, repurposing education, and stories to live by. What I will do, I will focus on the second one, repurposing education. And I completely agree with you. It is important to repurpose and to reconsider our position towards education. In the last few months, and last year or so, few months, I'm really wrestling with the idea of education and publication and knowledge. So one of the things I've been thinking of is publishing and publication. It seems that we are quite over-focusing on getting published in journal articles and only journal articles for the metrics and for the citations. This is important, but we need to know that there are other ways of publishing opportunities. In a workshop I conducted for the College of Graduate Studies a couple of months ago, I was targeting graduate students. And I said, there are at least 20 venues, 20 types of publication we can target, including book reviews, book chapters, books, conference proceedings, commentaries. We have at least 20 types of publication. Why should we disregard all of this and focus only on publishing in reference journals, which I believe is important, but we need to be aware of other types of publishing, and they are important because they have different audiences. So that is repurposing of publishing. Now, repurposing of education, again, I've been recently thinking of this idea. Now, do we really only publish for the publishing academia, for the publishing community? How about the professionals? How about the practitioners? How about the wider community? Quite often, our dissertations and theses and published articles, they are read and only read by researchers, by scholars, by the people of academia. And we are missing the people whom we should be targeting. For example, language teachers in the classroom, teachers in the education field, people on the ground. Are we really reaching the wider community, everyday people? We are not doing that. Quite often, our students are writing dissertations and theses, and they are touching upon really, really important issues. What really happens at the end of the day? Their work is left on the shelf. It is not taken up by practitioners. Maybe we are to blame. Not taken up by the wider community. and it goes there. Either it is read by other students, other researchers, and maybe nothing else. So what we really need to do is really to target the wider community and the professional community. Now, I remember once I read the book by Jerome Kagan, maybe you're aware of the book. He says the three cultures: natural sciences, social sciences, and the humanities. And I was thinking of, say, the three audiences for our writing, for our publishing. We have the audience of the academia, that is scholars and researchers. We have the professionals, practicing people, and we have the wider audience, the community. So really, in the field of education in particular, we need to target not only one audience, only the academia, only researchers, but we also need to target people on the ground, people in the classroom, that is the professionals and a practice-based research. And also we need to target people who are in society, wider community. So I thought to expand and to take your notion, Mark, which is absolutely wonderful, repurposing education and creating knowledge and sharing knowledge to go beyond just the narrow channel of publishing for the sake of publishing, publishing for the academia, publishing for the citation, publishing for the H-index and the I-index. These are important, but there are many other things that are equally important for us as human beings, as a professionals, and as people in the community. And I also like your idea of the University of Aberdeen. I actually read the manifesto, which you just cited, Reclaiming Our University, which is absolutely wonderful. The manifesto said that our university has become really commercialized. It is very much like money-making institution. And is this really the purpose of education, the purpose of knowledge, or is it for the welfare, for the well-being, and for the happiness of humanity? Now, how can you create happiness just for money and consumerism, like you mentioned, Mark, when Bush said you can go and shop? So the University of Aberdeen, some of the graduate students and academia, I really, they are amazing, and I really admire them for the step and the measure they have taken to reclaim their university and bring it back to the proper world where it is. It is the world of academia. It is the world of knowledge, humanistic aspects of knowledge, rather than commercialized use of knowledge. All right, I think this is what I want to say. Thank you very much. I am quite impressed by your presentation, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. And now on to Mark again for your response. I think we have we will extend for around 5 minutes or so. So I think it should be. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, both of you, for your comments. They were very helpful. I think I can only focus on one or two things probably, given the time, but with Dr. Hassan, one of the items that caught my eye really was this notion of scholarship identity. And I think that's a really important notion that, that when students come in for postgraduate education, part of what we're doing is shaping identities and really helping them think about who they are going to be or who they are as academics or as scholars or as educators. And I think more attention needs to be given to that. I know that it made me think of my own journey when I was teaching in Saudi Arabia, and then I went to school to do my PhD at Michigan State University, and it was the most disorienting experience I could imagine. I felt like I was it was semi-retirement. I wasn't quite sure what to do or when to do it. But I also went the other way. After graduating from Michigan State University, where I was trained as a scholar, as a researcher, I then went back into secondary high school classrooms to teach social studies in Taiwan. And I was completely lost. My identity had been shaped as a researcher or as a scholar. I said to my wife, I've lost it. Like, I don't know how to teach anymore. Like, I don't know how to talk to kids anymore. I don't, and so sometimes we get so isolated from these other communities that we forget what it means to kind of interact and to and really to kind of produce knowledge that might be more useful for other communities. And so I wanted to mention that because I think you know, really thinking about what kinds of identities are we producing as a form of postgraduate education is something that I think is important for us all to think about. And for graduate students, it's that question of, you know, who can I be or who do I want to be? What kind of scholar? Is it a scholar that is kind of in the ivory tower and walled off, or is it someone who's working with, you know, practitioners, you know, kind of the people that I think Dr. Ali was mentioning. You know, you have professionals and practitioners, and then you have the general public. And there's, so to move to Dr. Ali's comments, yeah, I think that a lot of the publication is driven by these metrics and by these university ranking systems. And, you know, we really need to rethink our obligation to professionals, to practitioners, but also to the general public. There's a lot of really great work done around like citizen science. And, you know, it's really where scientists are working hard to make their research much more accessible, much more useful to citizens, to the public, so that they understand things like climate change, so that they understand things like pandemic and public health. They understand vaccination. They don't have these, you know, they're not misinformed. We're finding that this is really, really important, that scientists have to do a better job at communicating, you know, knowledge and research and information to the public. These are matters of life and death. I mean, these have tremendous social impact. And so, yeah, I think you know, that's a hard shift for universities to make. But I do think that you know, there's a whole emerging field of knowledge mobilization and partnership and basically community-based research. I saw that one of the participants, I think in the Q&A, had mentioned something about, you know, suggestions for how to think big or to think deep, wide, long, but also, you know, publish because there's still traditional research goals. And I was going to share this October issue of Review of Educational Research, because there's an article, it's one of the top, I mean, it's a top journal in educational research, but there's a really wonderful article in there that's about the principles of collaborative education research with stakeholders. And so I think this more and more is being recognized in scholarly communities, that more research, and they outline several different types, like community-based design research, design-based implementation research, improvement science in networked improvement communities, strategic education research partnerships. I think this is being realized more and more that, you know, the kind of scholarly work that is necessary is actually done with partners in different communities, so that there's that sort of co-production of knowledge. There's the building of knowledge collaboratively and collectively with different communities. And so I think I think these are research methodologies that I hope, you know, researchers in postgraduate education or postgraduate students are learning about. You know, I think ethnography is an important research approach to be in communities with people and to be a participant observer, to be interacting with people. So ethnography, and then these more community-based methodologies, they are rigorous, they're scholarly, you can get published in top journals, I think, with these. And I think the scholarly community is recognizing the importance of this work. And so I do think there's some potential there. Okay, Myra, other questions? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. I think we have no more time left for the Q&A. We're running behind schedule, but thank you so
Okay,
much.
sorry.
That was really very inspiring, and as Professor Ali Shahade has pointed out, really quite revolutionary, which is the reason why we invited you as our keynote speaker to begin with. So thank you for delivering. So yeah.
And Myra, if anyone wants to contact me by email,
Yes.
I can put it in the chat. I'm fine
Yes,
with that
please.
if there's any questions. So I'll add it right now.
Perfect.
I usually put it at the end of my slides, and I'm sorry I didn't do that. But
Perfect.
anyways, there's my
Yeah.
email address if anyone would like. And please feel free to share the slides. And I know you're pressed for time, but I want to just wish all of you the best conference. It's a wonderful opportunity for cross-cultural exchange, and I'm sure it's going to be wonderful in terms of you know, the people who are organizing this. And thank you again. Thank you, UAE University and College of Education and all the organizers and people involved in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Professor Ali Shahade. Thank you, Professor Hassan, for your wonderful commentaries. I think Mark has left us with very thoughtful questions that we should really reflect on. And I invite our graduate students to really think about those four. What questions will you ask? What will be the consequences of your work? What kinds of social relationships do you want to create? And what type of world will you build through the questions you ask and the topics you investigate? So thank you so much, Mark, for that. So now it's 11:38 UAE time. 11:45, please join us for the parallel faculty workshop sessions, and 1 p.m. for the informal networking sessions with our graduate students. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.